The wind moved low across the plains that night, slow and careful, the way it did when even the land seemed to be holding its breath, and the ranch house stood alone against it, lantern light bleeding faintly through dusty windows, like a warning that something inside was about to change forever. And when she whispered, "Easy, it hurts," her voice was barely louder than the creak of the floorboards beneath her, but it cut through the room sharper than any blade, and the rancher froze, not because he was cruel, not because he was weak, but because he understood pain in a way only men who had buried too many secrets ever did. And in that frozen moment, memories rose uninvited. Drought years, broken cattle, a wife lowered into dry earth with no one left to cry but him, and now this woman, half broken, half defiant, standing before him like fate itself, had walked through his door and refused to leave, and the room smelled of iron and dust and old wood, and his hands, rough from years of rope and rain, hovered in the air as if touching her would seal something neither of them could undo. And when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, steady, terrifying in its calm. "It'll be over quick." Not a promise of harm, but of mercy, the kind mercy that only comes when there are no good choices left. And she looked at him then, really looked, eyes shining not with fear alone but with something worse, hope mixed with regret. And the night outside pressed closer as if it wanted to hear too, and he wondered, not for the first time, how a man who had survived wars, storms, and hunger could still feel so unprepared for the weight of another human life leaning into his hands. And the story of how she came to his ranch was already soaked in blood long before her boots crossed his threshold, because she had been running, not just from men, but from a truth buried so deep it had warped her bones, and the law had been closer than she'd expected, closer than he'd ever wanted again. And when she collapsed by the hearth earlier that evening, clutching her side and biting back screams, he knew the past had finally caught up to both of them. And now here they were, locked in a moment stretched thin as wire, where one wrong move would snap everything. And he told himself this was just another hard thing to be done, like setting a broken horse's leg or choosing which calf wouldn't he survive the winter. But his heart refused to listen, pounding loud enough he feared she could hear it, and she winced again, breath hitching, and whispered his name. How did she know his name already? And that was when the rancher realized this was no accident, no wandering soul seeking shelter, but a reckoning walking upright, bleeding quietly, and asking him to decide how much pain a person deserved before they were allowed peace. And the lantern flickered as if agreeing, shadows stretching tall and crooked along the walls, turning the room into a courtroom with no judge but him. And outside a horse snorted nervously, sensing the shift, sensing that by morning, nothing on this land would be the same again. And if you're listening to this story right now, leaning in closer as the tension tightens, remember, this is the kind of moment where lives split in two. And if you want to know what happens next, if you want stories that grip you like this and don't let go, make sure you're subscribed, because this rancher's choice is only beginning to reveal its cost. By the time the first hint of dawn pressed pale fingers against the horizon, the rancher understood that mercy was never simple, that every promise to make something over quick carried echoes long after the act itself ended. And as the woman sagged against the edge of the table, breath coming in sharp, uneven pulls, he steadied her with a gentleness that surprised them both, because the truth had finally begun to surface, and it came not in a scream but in a whisper, the kind that changes a man more deeply than any shout ever could. And she told him then about the river crossing where the wagon overturned, about the men who followed not for money but for silence, about the child she had buried beneath a cottonwood with no marker but her own shaking hands. And the rancher listened as if each word were a nail driven into old boards he'd thought long sealed, because he knew that kind of loss, knew how it hollowed you out until you were walking proof that survival wasn't the same thing as living. and when she cried out again, the sound cut short by clenched teeth. He finished what had to be done with care, not haste, keeping his word in the only way that mattered, minimizing pain where the world had offered none. And when it was finally done, when the room fell quiet except for the soft rasp of her breathing, he realized the freezing moment from the night before had been a doorway, and he had stepped through it whether he wanted to or not. And outside the sun rose over the range, lighting the scars in the land the same way truth lights scars in a person, not to shame them, but to remind them they survived. And she slept then, exhausted, while he sat at the table and waited for the sound he knew would come, the distant rhythm of hooves, because reckoning rarely travels alone. And when the riders finally appeared at the fence line, 3 silhouettes cutting across the gold morning, he didn't reach for his rifle right away, because something inside him had already decided that running was finished, that hiding only fed the kind of cruelty that had follow. Wed her this far, and when the men rode up and asked their questions with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, the rancher answered calmly, plainly, truth balanced carefully between his words like a loaded round, and the moment cracked open when one of them glanced past him and saw her through the window, alive, breathing, not broken enough to be forgotten. And in that instant the rancher understood what his life had been training him for all along. Not the wars, not the winters, not the lonely nights, but this choice, this stand. And when the gunfire finally broke the quiet, it was brief and brutal and final, dust lifting and settling again like the land itself refusing to remember the violence. And when it was over, he stood alone in the yard, hands shaking, knowing the price had been paid in full. And inside, she watched him through the glass, seeing not a savior or a monster, but a man who chose to end pain instead of passing it on. And weeks later, as scars healed and the ranch found a new rhythm, the two of them spoke less about what happened and more about what came next, because the future has a way of demanding attention once the past loosens its grip. And when she finally left, walking steady, eyes forward, she paused at the gate and thanked him, not for what he did, but for how he did it. And the rancher nodded, understanding that some stories aren't meant to be retold, only carried quietly. And if you've stayed with this story until now, if you felt that pause when he froze and the weight of what followed, then you already know why these stories matter, why they deserve to be heard, and why subscribing isn't just about a button. It's about choosing to return for moments like this, where pain meets compassion and leaves something lasting behind, because out on that wide, unforgiving land, the hardest truths are the ones that teach us how to be human.